Welcome to this short video in which we will be decoding the Digital Data Protection Bill 2023, which was passed in Lok Sabha on August 7, and it was yesterday passed in Rajya Sabha as well. And now India is just one step away from having its own data protection law for personal data of its citizens. So this is a two-part video. In this part one, we will be discussing the main provisions of this digital data protection bill. In part two of this video, we will be discussing the data protection management system, which is uh, kind of a system that organizations adopt in order to become compliant towards these data protection regulations and data protection laws. So the bill was introduced in the monsoon session of Lok Sabha on August 3, and then it got passed in Lok Sabha through a voice vote on August 7. The next stop was Rajya Sabha, where it was passed yesterday, and now it'll move to President's office. Once President's office reviews this and approves this, then this will become a law. Then Indian citizens will have a regulatory body, a framework in place, which can make companies accountable for storing their personal data or using their personal data. So, what data will be protected under this Digital Data Protection Act? Any information that can be used to identify an individual, such as full name, date of birth, address, Aadhaar number, PAN number, all these data elements that can be used to identify an individual will be covered under the protection of this Data Protection Act. This is a snapshot from Economic Times, where Times of India decoded this data protection bill for ordinary citizens. The first thing to notice in this snapshot is that the bill is named as Digital Personal Data Protection, meaning that this applies only to digital data. This will not apply to personal identifiable information data which is stored on paper or in any other physical form. So this will apply only to the digital data. Some of the main provisions that we will discuss here, we will not do a very deep dive into these provisions, just discuss them in a brief to give you a general idea, to give you a general grasp on the concept of this bill. So some of the main provisions are that now companies and business fiduciaries, they would need to take an explicit consent from the users before going ahead and processing their personal data. So there will be an explicit consent that a business needs to provide to the user, providing details on what data elements of PII it is collecting, for what purpose it will be using those, and those kind of things will go into the main provision. The consent architecture of this bill is very similar to other international data regulations, and it is at par with GDPR, which stands for Global Data Protection Regulation, and it is a European Union data protection standard, and the bill is following the principles that are stated in GDPR. Some of the approaches in the bill are a little different, like this block listing of cross-border transfer. The GDPR follows a kind of allow listing wherein the GDPR has a list of countries which the European Union deems as safe for processing the data of their citizens, and rest of all the countries which are not included in the list are banned from processing personal data of its citizens. But in India's data protection bill, we are following the block listing approach, wherein at present we are there is no uh, country that is blacklisted or blocklisted, uh, and it is allowed. Personal data protection, cross-border data transfer of personal data is allowed in all countries, but in future, government, the center will follow a blocklisting approach, wherein on a situation basis they will come up with some notifications to ban certain countries from processing personal data. To give you an example, tomorrow if government deems processing of personal data in China and Pakistan is risky, then they will come up with a regulation and they will circulate a notification to all companies stating that personal data of Indian citizens should not be processed within China and it should not be transferred to Pakistan. So, blocklisting is kind of an approach which I feel is a little inconvenient. Whitelisting or allow listing is kind of approach which is more appropriate, which GDPR is following. So this is a slightly different approach. Apart from that, the next provision is that there will be a data protection board headed by a data chairperson. So this data protection board will be the regulatory body which will be responsible for uh, imposing penalties on businesses, inspecting the books and accounts or statements, or even suggesting to the government to block internet intermediaries from Indian internet in case of any severe violations. The penalties can be imposed up to 250 crore or 500 crore depending on the data breach incidents. One change which was made in this bill is that this bill does not include any criminal penalties, including jail terms for CIO and other executive level uh, leaders. So this is a leaner version. For the digital data protection bill, the journey of this bill has been from last 6 years. India is trying to get um, a law for digital data protection, and previous bills that were pulled out from the Lok Sabha were a little fatter version of these of this. They had a lot of other clauses in it as well, which are no longer included in this new digital data protection bill. So this is a very leaner version and which got approved in both the houses, and very soon now India will have its own law. Impact on business and individuals, we will discuss this on the next slide. The bill allows transfer of processing of data in any country as of now, as I stated earlier. So companies and organizations have called for more clarity on this. The bill also excludes processing of personal data which is already available on the public domain, and so this will impact AI chatbots and search engines in a positive way. I feel it will not be much of a problem because the data that is the personal data that is already put out in the domain, which is already available over the internet, search engines and AI chatbots can use that data for their own benefit. So this should not be a problem. Explicit consent, we will discuss this on the next slide. So how will normal users get affected post implementation of this data bill? How you and me will benefit from this bill? Once this bill becomes the law, there will be a framework, a data protection board, a regulator system to handle data breach problems, which will kind of provide security for your and mine personal data, which companies mine and use and store. But this will cover only digital data, not physical data. This means even taking a picture of data counts. However, if someone only uses paper and never makes it digital, they won't have to follow these rules no matter how much data they have. Also, Indian businesses already deal with rules from US and Europe, so not much change will be needed in how they work, and the Data Protection Act of India stands on par with European Union's GDPR, so um, not major disruption is expected in the way tech companies are functioning. Startups will get affected initially in the short term because startups run tight on budget and they will have to spend a considerable amount of their capital to form a proper data protection management system within the organization to become compliant towards these regulations. So for startups, it's going to be a little problem, but for other companies, for other big businesses, tech startups, they are already following international data protection standards, and for them, a minimal disruption is expected. The bill is very industry friendly. It is aligning with the sectorial laws recognizing processing outside India for Indian subjects and allowing businesses to continue validity based on pre-existing consent, which means if you have given your consent to say Facebook or any other data fiduciaries in the past for using your PII data, then they don't need to reach out to you again with an explicit consent for using your PII data. However, they have to give you an option to opt out. So in this way, then it's deemed as a very industry friendly bill. Some companies have been operating unchecked for a very long time. They have been mining data without any security or privacy obligations. So it is a good thing that these companies will now be made accountable for um providing adequate protection for personal data of Indian citizens. So that's about this bill. As I had already said, this is going to be a very short, a brief video in which I just give you a general idea about the bill. Once the draft is out in public, we can then do a deep dive and understand more on the bill. In part two of this video, we will be discussing the data protection management system, which is a system that organizations use to become compliant towards these frameworks and these data protection regulations. And we will discuss what components form a part of this data protection management system and how organizations go about meeting the requirements of these regulations. So it will be an interesting video to understand how private data, how personal data is managed within the organization. So this bill is going to affect every company because even employee data is a personal falls under the category of PII because your official email address, your name, your address, your Aadhaar number, PAN number, a lot of things the organizations, your employer stores in their database, and they will have to follow these regulations. So in part two, we will discuss in detail how the data protection management system works and how it helps the organizations to become compliant towards these regulations. All right, then, thank you. I'll see you in the next part.